Most people believe they are being paid for their work. In reality, they are being paid to stay inside a structure. They believe more effort eventually produces more security. But effort was never the problem. The problem is something much quieter, much more structural, and much harder to see when you are standing inside of it. And once you see it, you will never look at your job the same way again. This is not motivation. This is a structural observation about how the time for money system actually works. Watch carefully. A man works 10 years inside the same company. His income increases slowly, but his time disappears completely. And at some point he begins to ask a quiet question. Why does more effort never seem to move the destination? The assumption that nearly every person carries from the moment they enter the working world. It is not taught explicitly. It does not need to be. It is absorbed through observation, through culture, through every early message about what a responsible adult does with their life. The assumption goes like this: if you work hard, you will be rewarded. If you are reliable, your income will grow. If you give your time fully, you will eventually arrive at a place of security. This is the foundational belief. Work harder, earn more, stay longer, advance further. Be disciplined with your hours, and financial stability will follow. It is a deeply human belief, and it is not entirely false. Within certain narrow conditions, effort does produce proportional results. A person who works 2 hours earns less than a person who works 8. A person who is promoted earns more than a person who is not. So the pattern seems confirmed. The assumption feels reasonable. But here is where something begins to crack, quietly, often without a name. People apply enormous effort. They arrive early and leave late. They take on more responsibility. They develop skills. They demonstrate value. And yet something does not move. The financial outcome does not shift in proportion to the effort applied. The security they were promised remains perpetually one step ahead. The more they reach for it, the further it recedes. This is an observation, and it is far too consistent to be coincidence. What actually happens when you observe the pattern clearly is this: effort increases. Competence increases, but the financial outcome remains anchored within a range. A person earns 20% more over 5 years of dedicated work, perhaps 30%. They receive a title. They receive acknowledgement. But the structural ceiling of what is possible within their arrangement barely shifts, and so they conclude that the problem must be them. They are not working hard enough. They are not working smart enough. They do not have the right network, the right degree, the right personality. They try a different approach. They work differently. And the outcome remains, once again, within that same narrow band. The frustration is not random. The stagnation is not personal failure. It is the predictable output of a very specific structural mechanism. Here is what that mechanism actually is. When a person sells their time for money, they enter a particular kind of structure. This structure has properties, and those properties determine outcomes in ways that have almost nothing to do with individual effort. The first property is this: time is finite and uniform. Every person has the same 24 hours. A person who works 8 hours produces a certain output. A person who works 12 hours produces more. But the relationship between time and output has a ceiling. There is a physical limit to how many hours can be sold. The structure, by its very nature, caps the upside. The second property is that in this structure, value is determined not by the person providing the labor, but by the entity purchasing it. This is a critical distinction. When you sell your time, you do not set the price according to the full value you generate. The buyer sets the price according to what the market will bear, what the role is categorized as, and what the system has agreed your category of labor is worth. your individual effort, your dedication, your extra hours. These are inputs into a system whose output is controlled by someone else entirely. This is not exploitation in a dramatic sense. It is simply the structure of the arrangement. You agreed to exchange your time for a fixed or semi-fixed compensation. The value you generate above that amount flows upward in the structure. That is not a moral statement, it is a structural description. The third property is what I would call the metric problem. Inside a time-for-money structure, effort is visible, but value is often invisible. What is measured is attendance, output volume, compliance with process, and time spent. What is not easily measured is the actual economic value generated by an individual's contribution. Because it is difficult to measure, it is rarely rewarded proportionally. The person who generates 3 times the value of their colleague does not typically earn 3 times the compensation. They earn slightly more within the range the system has designated for that role. So effort and compensation become structurally disconnected. Not always, not universally, but consistently enough that the pattern is observable. Now there is a fourth property that is perhaps the most consequential. It is the question of control. In a time-for-money structure, the person selling their time does not control the system they work within. They can influence it, they can demonstrate value within it. But the decisions about how the system operates, what it produces, how resources are allocated, and who benefits from growth, those decisions belong to whoever owns the structure. This matters enormously. Because when you do not own the structure, your effort makes the structure more valuable without making you proportionally more valuable. You can improve a system you do not own. You can optimize a process you do not control. You can generate significant value within an arrangement that channels most of that value somewhere other than toward you. The person who designed the structure benefits when the structure performs well. The person who executes within the structure benefits within the limits the structure has set for them. These are 2 fundamentally different positions. And most people spend their entire working lives in the second position, believing they are moving toward the first. Now let us look at what happens psychologically when a person builds their identity inside this structure, because this is where the experience becomes not just frustrating, but genuinely disorienting. When a person enters a time-for-money structure and begins to advance within it, something natural happens. They begin to associate their identity with their position in the structure. Their title becomes an expression of their worth. Their salary becomes a measure of their progress. Their productivity becomes the primary proof that they are doing something meaningful with their life. This is deeply understandable. Human beings need to feel that their effort has significance, and when the external world confirms that significance through promotion, through raises, through recognition, the person naturally anchors their sense of self to those confirmations. But here is the subtle problem. When your identity becomes attached to your position in a structure you do not own, you become invested in the structure's continuation rather than in your own genuine progress. You begin to defend the system. You begin to interpret any challenge to the system as a challenge to your own worth. You work to advance within the hierarchy precisely because advancement within the hierarchy has become the definition of success. The career ladder does not just organize positions. It organizes meaning. Each rung is not merely a salary increase. It is a signal of personal value, a confirmation that the investment of time and effort was legitimate, that the sacrifice was worthwhile, and so people climb, not always because they love the work, not always because the work produces what they actually want, but because the structure has convinced them that climbing is the same thing as progressing. that more responsibility equals more freedom, that a bigger title means a larger life. This is the psychological trap inside the structural trap. The system does not just consume your time. It gradually shapes what you believe time should be used for. There is also the dimension of comparison. Inside these structures, people are continuously measured against each other. Performance reviews, rankings, salary bands, promotional timelines. The comparison is constant and institutionalized, and the comparison creates a specific psychological effect. It redirects a person's attention away from absolute questions about what they actually want, what kind of life they are building, what the work is ultimately producing, and toward relative questions. Am I ahead of the person next to me? Am I advancing faster than average? Is my trajectory better than theirs? These relative questions feel urgent and important, but they are largely irrelevant to the deeper question of whether the structure itself is capable of producing the outcome a person actually seeks. A person can win the comparison game entirely. They can rise to the top of the structure, earn more than anyone around them, receive every acknowledgement the system has to offer, and still find themselves in the same fundamental position. Still trading time for money. Still operating within a ceiling they did not set. Still dependent on the decisions of whoever owns the structure they have mastered. This is the quiet irony of exceptional performance within a limiting structure. The more skillfully you execute the arrangement, the more invisible the arrangement's limitations become. You become so good at the game that you stop questioning the game. And the frustration, the nagging sense that something is not adding up, that feeling gets interpreted as ingratitude or restlessness, or a character flaw rather than as an accurate perception of a structural reality. This brings us to a final observation. The time for money structure is not a conspiracy. It is not a deception designed by malicious actors. It emerged from a particular set of historical and economic conditions. It has served certain purposes. It continues to function as a system for organizing large amounts of human labor toward coordinated outcomes. But it was not designed with your individual financial freedom as a primary output. That was never its purpose. Its purpose is to coordinate labor for the benefit of the structure itself and for those who own the structure. That is what it does, efficiently, reliably. When a person enters this structure believing it was designed to produce their financial independence, they are operating under a misalignment between their expectation and the structure's actual design. The disappointment that follows is not the result of the person failing the structure. It is the result of the structure never having been designed to produce what the person expected. The person who works for 30 years and retires with modest savings did not fail to work hard enough. They worked inside a structure that was calibrated to return a modest portion of what they generated consistently across their entire working life. The structure performed exactly as designed. The disappointment is a measurement of the gap between the expectation and the design. This is important to sit with, because most of the frustration, the self-doubt, the cycles of effort followed by stagnation that people experience in their working lives, these are not personal failures. They are the predictable and mathematically consistent outputs of a structure whose design most people never examined. When you see the structure clearly, something shifts. Not immediately, not dramatically. But the quality of the question changes. The question is no longer, what am I doing wrong? The question becomes, what structure am I operating within, and what is that structure actually designed to produce? That is a different question entirely, and it is a more honest one. The person who has been running faster and faster on a track that loops back to the same starting point does not need to run faster. They need to look up from the track long enough to see that it is a loop. You are not failing. You were operating inside a structure, and structures produce outcomes long before effort has a chance to change them. You were operating with great effort, with real dedication, and in many cases with considerable intelligence, inside a structure that was never designed to produce the outcome you expected from it. The effort was real. The commitment was real. The sacrifice was real. The structure was simply designed for a different destination than the one you had in mind. That is not a judgment of the structure, and it is certainly not a judgment of you. It is simply an observation about alignment, about what structures are actually built to do and what human beings naturally expect them to do. And when those two things are not the same, no amount of additional effort will close the gap. That gap is structural. Seeing it is the beginning of something different, not something dramatic, not a revolution, just a clearer view, a quiet, structural clarity about where you are, what the system around you was designed to produce, and whether those two things are actually pointing in the same direction. That is enough. For now, that is enough.